welcome to another edition of Public Interest. We're so happy that you can join us. I'm Gabriela Patram. With me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and lead of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome, and it's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's good to be back on the program, Gabby.
Sir, I want us to continue our discussions today on the coalition. We would have started a discussion a few programs before, and we're going to be paying some attention to the small parties. My first question to you, Mr. Granger, is that a Partnership for the National Unity was founded 10 years ago by 5 parties. Do I have that number correct? 5?
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, great.
There were some affiliates, but there were 5 main parties.
5 main parties. 2 parties withdrew last year, and 2 joined this year. I think sometime around last week that was announced. So what has been the effect of these changes in the APNU?
APNU was quite disappointed at the withdrawal of 2 parties.
Okay.
It is, of course, entirely within their right. There's no binding agreement. There was no discussion really, but the parties felt aggrieved with certain matters and they withdrew. And the withdrawal had to be accepted. There was no choice. So there was some disappointment at that time last year. Fortunately, 2 persons who were members of the 2 parties withdrew, Mr. Sharma, who was a member of the Justice for All Party, and Mrs. Tabitha Sarabo-Hali, who was a member of the Working People's Alliance. Both had served as ministers in the previous administration, and both established their own parties and applied to rejoin the APNU. That is to say, Ms. Sarabo-Hali established the Guyana Nation Builders Movement, and Mr. Sharma established the Equal Rights and Justice Party. There's no antipathy, there's no antagonism, and we were happy, the APNU was happy to receive those 2 new parties, which have now become partners in APNU. So there's no magic about it. We're back up to strength. We feel we're stronger together. And we applaud the decisions of the 2 members who were both younger and their experience, because they were both in Parliament before. And they're certainly not newcomers to the political scene. And they have, each has a manifesto or concept paper, and they will be going out campaigning and bringing in their own constituents into APNU. So we are strong, and the accession of those 2 new parties has strengthened the APNU. And although it's a loss to have the 2 former parties withdraw, it's a strength for 2 other parties to come on board. So we're good to go.
Great. Sir, in a coalition, and with this coalition, the APNU AFC, what factors still hold the APNU AFC coalition parties together? I ask you that is because the APNU and AFC won the general and regional elections in 2015, establishing the longest surviving coalition in the country's government. What are some of the factors probably that would have held you during the 5 years and still hold you today?
Mainly, we have a common vision. You can call it the vision thing. We have a shared vision of where we want to see Guyana go, the use of its resources, the form of governance. And there was some lengthy discussion before we came together. Most important also is the fact that there's a written accord binding the 2 parties, the APNU and the AFC, together, so that allocation of seats and other important elements in the relationship are recorded and agreed to, and we have not breached those agreements. and the relationship is quite respectful.
Okay.
In the 11th Parliament, between 2015 and 2020, we had two AFC vice presidents. The Prime Minister himself was a vice president, and Mr. Ramjita was a vice president. And there were several ministers. So there was a very strong AFC representation. And as I said, it was a respectful relationship. Now, I should point out that all of the partners in the APNU had positions in the last parliament, in the previous parliament. And I would say that relations were generally respectful, and that is the reason why we succeeded. In 5 years, we achieved quite a lot, and we were able to keep the coalition together. And of course, there's a difference between the coalition and the partnership. APNU is the partnership, and APNU as a partnership went into a coalition with the AFC, and that is what formed the government. But the APNU continues as a partnership, and the coalition is still working as the opposition in the National Assembly. So the bases were never shaken. We still have a common vision, and as you can see in the National Assembly, APNU and AFC are working together to provide a good life for the Guyanese people. That's what is happening, and that's why we're together, because we have a shared vision.
Okay. And sir, how can small parties enhance political representation in the country? I think for the general and regional elections of 2020, we had 9 small parties contesting. And I have here together they won 9,096 votes, which was enough to gain them 1 seat in the National Assembly, which is represented by Mr. Schuman. So, sir, how can small parties enhance political representation in the country?
Small parties represent interests, sometimes maybe of small groups, special interests, maybe ethnic groups, and they might represent indigenous people, could be religious groups, might be a religious party. There was one small party which used to be called the Doctors' Party, but small parties bring to life, political representation. And we are a very complex country. We are not a homogeneous country with one ethnic group, and people live in large areas of the country. The population density is only 3.5 persons per square kilometer, so they're scattered. Many people in the coastline don't understand what the interests of the people in the hinterland are. Maybe people who are Christians or Hindus may not understand Islam. So it is important that we don't gloss over the differences among people, among regions in this country, and that we have some mechanism for providing representation for those special interests. And this is the function of small parties, and I recognize that special interest, and I support small parties going out to represent these interests. And that is why I'm very happy and very proud to be the chairman of a partnership which has 5 members, and no 2 members are the same. The Guyana Action Party is largely based in the hinterland, and it is strong. The National Front Alliance has particular interest in cooperatives and labor. The PNC has interest in a broader field, and I am convinced that the new Guyana Nation Builders movement will be based largely in the villages and urban areas, and also that the Equal Rights and Justice Party has a strong base in rural areas. And Mr. Sharma, has done a lot of work in West Demerara, and he has a constituency, and Mr. Abuhari has a constituency. So they will be bringing, even though small in numbers, they will be bringing people into the partnership. And that is what was responsible for our success in previous years, and that is what is keeping us going. So I respect and recognize the role of small parties, and I expect that they will continue to discharge this responsibility to their constituents, and of course to bring those constituents into the Partnership for National Unity.
Sir, on that same note of special interest from citizens, do you think that is why so many small parties have emerged? Guyana has a small electorate, yet there are about 20 political parties, of which 9 participated last year in the general and regional elections. Why did so many small parties emerge, and what has been their impact?
The impact is to, or has been to, give representation to these previously silent voices. I mean, quite frankly, it ought not to matter even if there are 100 parties. As the saying goes, let 100 flowers bloom. The important thing is that no group should feel excluded or marginalized or alienated. The size doesn't matter, the issue is what matters. And I was very happy to see such a large number of small parties come out in 2020. Okay. And unfortunately, some of them have disappeared from the scene. But that is not our doing. That is a matter for the members to decide. But I must emphasize that Guyana is a very diverse country, and it is possible that some of the bigger parties might not be fully conscious or fully aware of the interests of some of the so-called minority groups. Right now in Guyana, young people are an important voice, and my party, the PNC, tries to give representation to young people. Most of the new parliamentarians are much younger than the parliamentarians who served in the 10th or 11th Parliament. So we are recognizing the role of youths. We recognize the role of diversity. APNU, I think, appointed the first indigenous person as a vice president. We had African vice president. We had an Indian vice president. And it's a recognition of diversity. And when people go around the country, they will see how diverse this country is. One of our MPs in the present cohort, the 12th Parliament, has come from as far as Mbutero. Another one is from down south in the Rupununi. This is what we want to see. Somebody else is from the west, in the upper Mazaruni. So you can see that the smaller parties inside of the larger APNU, inside of the government, bring sectional or specific or special interests, so that people all around the country know that they're represented in the APNU. That is the role that they could play, and in a diverse country, we don't want to see the interests of any group smothered or overwhelmed by the larger group. And I feel that our partnership, APNU, and our party, the PNC, has worked towards the goal of having an inclusionary democracy. And it is working well. And we welcome small parties, naturally. We hope that small parties would come into the APNU. But it is their right, and I was very happy to see so many of them emerge. I'm very disappointed too that some of them have disappeared off the political scene.
But sir, the People's National Congress and the People's Progressive Party have been the two major dominant parties in local politics for over 6 decades. What is responsible for this dominance, though, in the local politics of these two major parties?
I can speak for my own party.
Okay.
The PNC is trusted. We have been in existence, as we say, for over 6 decades. And we do have core support countrywide among all ethnic groups, in all geographical regions. And people believe in us, and I expect people will continue to support us. because when we go to the National Assembly, when we go into government, we represent their interests. It must be said that, although we're not a one-party state, we're also not a two-party state, we are a multi-party state. And my party has recognized this idea, this principle, by not trying to smother smaller parties. And the difference is that my party, the PNC, is a growing party because it is flexible and it admits members through the partnership, through the APNU. So we're not exclusive. We don't prevent people from coming into the APNU, but at the same time, when people come into the APNU, we don't try to smother them, we don't try to take over the party. They come with their own voices, and they come with their own interests. So that is the difference between the two parties. I don't know how the PPP operates. I know they don't have partners. Perhaps they are more like the traditional Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party, that you used to see in Eastern Europe and so before the disappearance of the Soviet Union. But we're different. We accept the principle of coalition, and we accept the principle of speaking to partners respectfully. I don't see the PPP doing the same thing. I don't see the PPP embracing partnership and attempting to share office with other parties. It is quite clear that the PNC, through the APNU, shared office with other political parties that were willing to come into the APNU. And the PPP is quite different. Why we have existed so long, as I said, I can speak for my party, the PNC, people trust us. Mm-hmm. People have seen good leadership and good governance, and we will continue to serve those people for decades to come. So we have experience, and we have the trust of the masses of people who've come out to support us over and over again.
Sir, you've spoken so extensively about the Big Ben app. Mm-hmm. And you have also made calls and extend invitation and welcome for other small parties to come join or come under the Big Ben app, so that they can probably move away from the winner takes all politics. As serving as president and now you're leader of the PNC, how likely are small parties, though, to accept the APNU's Big Ben app theory?
I would feel, or I do feel, that the type of politics we had before our coalition, before our partnership, was sort of cutthroat politics. It was a winner-takes-all politics. And when you're dealing with two near-equal parties, it's a recipe for confrontation and conflict. Okay. I think the days of that conflict, that confrontation, as far as they concern people's rights and people's interests, are past. We need to have a more cooperative type of government, so that when we are faced with problems, as we are faced with problems now. I mean, the pandemic is huge, and it is clear that the one-party government has been incapable of managing the pandemic efficiently or effectively. It is still a problem. We are faced with the biggest flood in our history. Every single region is affected. And the one-party approach to managing this flood is failed, is flawed. And people are now trying to shut out the opposition, trying to shut out nearly half of the population from decision making in these two major areas, the pandemic and the flood. So I would say that the winner-takes-all style that the PPP still practices is obsolete. It is not working for Guyana, even if it was a factor in building up the parties in years gone by. We have now come to a stage in which the major parties, or all of the parties in Guyana, must be able to have their voices heard and have their interests represented. I am not confident that the PPP is inclined to have a more inclusionary form of government. And every day we see that exclusionary politics have failed, and we need to embrace inclusionary politics. By getting 51% of the vote, you cannot behave as if you have 100% of the votes. That is the problem in Guyana. The PPP is behaving as if it has 100% of the vote, and it's not true, and it isn't working. And they must desist from this type of exclusive, exclusionary type of political behavior. It is hurting the country. It is hurting the people.
Sir, my final question to you is, the proportional system would have replaced the plurality system of the electoral representation in the country over 56 years ago. How has the proportional system influenced political participation?
I would say that in the entire political history of Guyana, since what I would call participatory politics started in the 1950s, with the universal adult franchise. The change of the electoral system was the single most important factor, and this happened in 1964, as you say, it's 56 years ago. It was born in very difficult times, traumatic times, violent times, but we have embraced the system more or less for over half a century. Now, in the previous system, what you call the plurality system, which is similar to the first past the post system,
Okay.
It could mean that a party with a minority of votes could form the government, and the majority could be in the opposition and locked out of government. And this is exactly what happened in the elections of 1957 and 1961, in which, this is almost arithmetically incredible. The PPP was able to win, I think 43% of the vote and get 57% of the seats. And the United Force and the PNC together were able to win 57% of the vote and get 43% of the seats. It was ludicrous. And this is what led to the confrontation in the mid-60s, that a minority party was behaving as if it was a majority. And in fact, although it had the majority of seats in what was then called the Legislative Council, which is now the National Assembly, it actually had a minority support of the electorate. This led to a big confrontation, and the British government ordained that the system must be changed, and in 1964 elections, the system was changed to a proportional representation system, which is more or less what we have now. There have been some modifications, but more or less that's what we have now. So instead of having the lopsided system in the 1960s, in which 43% of the electorate would have 57% of the seats, we now have a system in which if you get 43% of the votes, you get 43% of the seats. So it's a fair system. So I would say that the present system has moved us closer to equity and to fairness. And also, maybe this is an unintended consequence, it has led to the proliferation of smaller parties, which is a healthy development. It has made coalitions possible. And in fact, the government in 1964 was a coalition government between the People's National Congress and United Force. And that fell apart for a variety of reasons. But we can see that now, in 2021, or in 2020, the GRE, coalitions became possible again because there was a proliferation of small parties. And we were able to win in the APNU because we had the support of the Alliance for Change and 5 parties. There were 6 of us together in the APNU. And our strength is derived from the partnership and from the coalition. The PPP has got a slim majority now, and although they have no coalition, they have no binding agreement that I'm aware of with any small party, they seem to have influenced some of the small parties. It's quite clear that some of the small parties have disappeared, but this Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly is a member of a small party, and several other persons who used to belong to the small parties have aligned themselves to the PPP. I don't know the nature of the relationship. I know the nature of the relationship within the APNU, which is a very formal and respectful relationship. But the big change in Guyanese politics came about when the decision was made initially by the British government to remove from the plurality system, which was harmful, it was confrontational, it was conflictual, to the proportional system. We've embraced this, as you say, for 56 years, and I believe that is the way of the future. I believe in coalitions, and I believe that the electoral system that we have in Guyana favors coalition, favors small parties, and I'd like the system to continue. And I think this is good for Guyana, it is good for democracy, and it's good for the development of this country.
Well, Mr. Granger, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure having you on the program, and I look forward to having you next week. To you, our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us again, and we encourage you on behalf of all of us here at Public Interest to please continue to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. I'm Gabriela Patram. Goodbye.